Hello, folks. Welcome back to English 102. This is a video lecture on your Logical Fallacies Quiz. So this is Module 2, due a week from today, September 13th. And there are two, if I scroll down to the detailed module section in the syllabus, there are two video lectures to help you study for this fallacies quiz. The first is over what is rhetoric. There's a PowerPoint file in PDF form in our Google Drive, and there's an accompanying video lecture, which is now linked to in the Canvas module. I also sent out a message to you about that. And then this video lecture is over this basic logic and logical fallacies handout, both of which are in our Google Drive here. This is the grid form. If you toggle over here, this button, you can have the list form. If you click on the logic and rhetoric folder, you'll see that the basic logic handout that we're going to go over is in here, and at the very bottom is the what is rhetoric file. Again, all of this is linked to in the module 2 of Canvas. So this is ultimately going to help you, along with the first MLA quiz, help you produce strong argumentative papers, all of which are essay 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the course schedule. So in this handout here of basic logic, the first couple of pages I'm not going to go over too closely because, as it says, you know, it's basic logic and it's kind of straightforward. You know, like, what is an argument? Well, there's a reason and conclusion. There's some examples of basic arguments, and then a diagram here of a basic argument. So one thing to keep in mind about an argument is that, as this bold arrow line shows here, an argument needs to be linear to go from point A to point B, if you will. As we'll see, if it starts at point A and then returns to point A, then it's circular or tautological tautology argument. There are two fundamental basic types of argument in human discourse. I'll just zoom out so you can see both on one page. There's up here at the top, this arrow, the inductive argument that goes from general to specific. And then there's at the bottom of this page 2 of this handout is the deductive argument that is just the opposite. And therefore, the triangle is turned upside down, goes from general to specific. We use these types of arguments all of the time, especially this inductive argument. Over here, I've given a couple of examples. Basically, what this argumentative structure does, as most scientific experiments and evidence-based reports do, is they build up an accretion or a mass of data, you know, fact, and then they draw a broad general conclusion based on the data or the facts. There is, however, in the middle here, a gray area, what we might otherwise call a leap of faith or the inductive leap. Let me give an example of this. So you list a fact: my cat has fur, my neighbor's cat has fur, cats at the pet store all have fur, all cats I've seen have fur. And then you take an inductive leap based on that evidence, and you go, therefore all cats have fur. But I think many of you may know where I'm going with this, that in fact there is an actual creature a feline that does not have fur. Kind of bizarre looking feline, known as a Sphinx cat or an Egyptian cat. Not sure you'd want to wake up to see that every morning, but for people who have trouble with cats, dander or whatnot, maybe that works for them. Anyhow, all right, going back to this. So when we take an inductive leap or leap of faith in this kind of inductive argument, we, can get ourselves into trouble because, unless we're God and we know everything, we don't have all of the facts. We have again, a buildup or accretion of facts. The next kind of argument is a little trickier, this deductive argument, trickier in the sense that it's more rigidly defined, as you can see here from this major premise, minor premise, conclusion breakdown. It starts with a broad general premise, therefore it's major, it's applied to the entire category. So here, for example, people who perform with courage and determination in crisis are great leaders. So if there is no, qualifier in front of it, like some or many people, we necessarily have to assume that it's all people or everything in that category. And therefore it's considered a broad or major premise. A premise is a fancy word for, assertion or idea. And then a minor premise right below it takes one or a portion of this broad category of people. And in this case, it takes Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, and then says, in this case, Lincoln, specific person of all people, performed with courage and determination a crisis, referring, of course, to the Civil War. And conclusion, which, by the way, you want to take some good quick notes in your lectures. This is the logical operator symbol for therefore. So you can add that to your note taking. So conclusion, therefore, Lincoln was a great leader. And so it's the interplay of the major premise and minor premise that yields us a conclusion in this deductive argument. Here's perhaps one of the most famous deductive arguments, which is about Socrates, the philosopher. All humans are mortal, and by definition, all humans die and therefore are mortal because mortality is death. Socrates, one of the category of humans. Socrates was a human. Conclusion, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, this fundamental major premise, minor premise conclusion is called a categorical syllogism, or can be represented as a categorical syllogism, using what many of you may be familiar with, what are known as Venn diagrams by the German mathematician Venn. So we call these categorical because they are categories of things or persons, places, ideas, actions, and so on. And you can check the validity of a categorical syllogism or deductive argument by using this 4-step method here. Step 1 is you have it written down as a major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Step 2 is you term it, you put it into its fundamental terms. So human is the first term, mortality is the second term, it's a new term. Socrates is a new term. And then human, we already have human here, as you can see from the gray dotted line. So we don't say D, we use A again. And that's part of the rules right below it. There are these rules for categorical syllogisms. And rule 1 says a syllogism can only contain 3 terms, A, B, and C. And we have the conclusion, therefore C, Socrates was B, mortal. The third step is almost like a mathematical kind of condensation or distillation of those terms that all A over here is B, and then we say all A equals B, and likewise all C equals A, therefore all C equals B. And then step by step, slowly, you go in order. You say, okay, how do I show or represent all of the A's are or equal to or belong to B? You have the larger B here, and you metaphorically, symbolically pour all of the A's, the smaller A here, circle inside of B's. So that means that all of the A's are now contained or belong to or equal B. And likewise, using the same strategy, how do you show all C equals A? Well, you do the same thing. You take C and you pour all of them inside of A, and therefore all C equals A. And the conclusion says all C equals B. Is that right? Well, let's look. All of the C's here are now automatically inside of B. So this is a valid argument. It's constructive validity, but is it also true? Well, yes, it is also true because Socrates was in fact mortal. He did die. We know that for a fact. So it's both true and valid, but there are times when you can have a valid argument, but it not be true. And likewise, you can have an invalid argument and a false argument. So that's just a kind of quick overview of the kind of formal way of discerning the validity of deductive arguments. And there are some exercises here you can take a shot at. But today's lecture is really about these logical fallacies, which are the most common. And it's broken down into two categories. So the first category is fallacies resulting from oversimplifying. And a few pages down, the second category are fallacies resulting from ignoring the issue. And as I say, these are more pernicious or evil because they are often deliberate by the speaker or writer. So let's take a look at these. And by the way, at the end of this handout, the last 2 pages are the logical fallacy quiz questions. Right here, they're in kind of non-multiple choice answer, but what you would need to do is say, when you get to the quiz, you have this statement here. And many of these statements are by famous people, but also just general statements. What you're supposed to do is determine, all right, if it says all of us cannot be well known because all of us cannot be famous, then you look up here at the logical fallacy list, which we're going to go over here in this handout, and say, okay, which is the best fit for this particular fallacy that's being committed. So this is why I wanted to do this video lecture, because logical fallacies are in effect word problems. You know, like if you think of math word problems, right? You have to kind of abstractly put together the formula and then yield an answer. And I want to help you guys learn how to do this, because the many of you may not now think, oh, I'm just an undergraduate, I'm not going to go to graduate school, but some of you may already have your eyes set on graduate school, and some of you 5-10 years down the road may think, well, I don't need to go to graduate school. The GRE, the LSAT, the MCAT, the Praxis, but especially the GRE, MCAT, and LSAT, they all have components of logic and reason on them, often in these kind of word problem formats. So hopefully this exercise and quiz information will help you not just now in your undergraduate career, but later in your life. So here's an example that I give you. Everyone at this company takes home a few office supplies, so feel free if you want. Kind of line of reasoning we've heard from some people, that everyone is doing it, so to speak, right? And the fallacy that's being committed here is called either common practice or bandwagon. And the reason for it is because others are engaging in the same behavior, right? So in the quiz, you would be presented like with this statement and then a multiple choice list of the possible answers, and you select the correct one. Then the other portion of the quiz involves this story, which is part 2, if you will, of the quiz. And the story is simply this right here. And what you have to do is answer true or false to these statements based solely on this story. In other words, you cannot bring in any outside information or infer that something happened. It has to be stated explicitly in the story and only in the story to answer these questions or statements correctly. Okay, going back to the fallacies themselves. The first one is an overstatement, also commonly called or known as stereotyping, or stereotyping as a type of overstatement. So there are many types of stereotypes. There's the, obvious racial stereotype, religious, ethnic, political, occupational, ageist stereotype, and so on. And so what they're doing is they're taking the entire category, think of, one of those circles again, the entire pie, if you will, or category, and they're saying all people are like this, right? So if you say all, let's use this, where is it, political, right here. All Republicans are white conservatives, right? But if you can find one, and just one, maybe more, but just one is all you need to debunk the argument. If you can find one person of color who is also conservative and belongs to the Republican Party, then you cannot therefore say all Republicans are X, Y, or Z. A common, claim is that children love clowns, right? Well, some children love clowns, but you yourself may not love clowns, right? You may balk or freak out at clowns because they can be like Chucky, kind of scary. Or another example is that lawyers are only interested in making money. And remember, go back up to the Lincoln example here, right? So if it says people who do X, Y, or Z, we have to assume that it means all people, that there is not a qualifier like some or many or most. And so it just says lawyers are interested, and therefore we have to say all lawyers. So it's not true that all lawyers are interested in making money. Many are, right? And so what I've just done there is I've qualified the argument, and a qualifier is incredibly important in logical argumentation. And I will be looking for this in your writing to make sure that you are not overstating any claims. So you need words like it may be X, Y, or Z, or could be, or probably, or possibly, many people, or some people, or nearly all, a majority, right, or virtually, might, and so on. All of those words help restrict your argument from the broad category of all to some portion. So we could say, to make this logical, some lawyers are interested in making money, or many, or virtually all, or whatever, but it's not all. Because they're, for two reasons. One, there's something called the pro bono case, where if you have a case that, lawsuit that needs to be taken, but you can't pay for it, you can ask your attorney or some attorney that if they can take it for pro bono, means they're taking it for free. Pro means for something, bono is from the root of the word, like benefit, right? Or in this case, good. And like nurses and doctors, attorneys, every period, every few years, they have to renew their legal license or law license, right? And in order to renew that license, they have to show they've done a number of hours pro bono work. So you might ask them if they can take a pro bono case if necessary. But there's also something called a public defender. So a public defender is, think of the Miranda rights, right? If you're entitled to an attorney, but if you cannot afford one will be appointed to you, right? So these are appointed by the state or the federal court. And these people, they're attorneys, right, or lawyers, but they don't make nearly the same amount of money as, say, a private law firm or corporate lawyer would. All right, moving on to hasty generalization, letter B. So hasty generalization is similar to overstatement. And so there's a fine line between these, but notice that in these previous kind of one-off statements of overstatement, there are no real facts given. What hasty generalization does is it tries to create an inductive argument. Remember, inductive argument is this right here, the fact, 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 therefore conclusion. What's happening here is there's too few facts, right? That it still oversimplifies because it offers insufficient evidence or examples or facts. So it's too quick or too hasty to draw the conclusion based on so little facts. So here's an example or a few. And it starts with the conclusion. Grow quick fertilizer is useless. So that's the conclusion. Why is it? Well, here are a couple of facts. Since we applied it last week, our grass has remained brown. Well, are there other possible reasons why the grass is brown? First of all, a week isn't that necessarily long of a time. And you could have applied too much or too little. And the grass itself could have had a pre-existing condition, so to speak, of like worms or, root disease or something. So no matter how much fertilizer you use, it may not get better. Likewise, let's look at this one right here. This also starts with the conclusion that political life must lead many to sexual frustration. And it's going to give a couple of pieces of facts, but it's not enough. In the last 6 months, so that's one piece, a duration of time, like previously in the fertilizer, it was a week. In this case, it's 6 months. The last 6 months, the media has written about 5 members of Congress who have either confessed to sexual harassment or have resigned. So this is not enough data or evidence because Congress used collectively, meaning both the United States Senate and the House of Representatives, is a much larger body than 5 people. The Senate, you may recall, is always a fixed number of 100. 50 states, 2 per state, 50 times 2 is 100, unless, of course, we annex Puerto Rico or something as a new state, then it'd be 102. So there's 100 plus the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives is based on proportional representation of states, and it has 435. So 100 plus 435 is 535, and here we only have 5 members who have confessed. So it's too quick or hasty, again, to draw a conclusion based on that little bit of evidence. A forced hypothesis is an error of, wanting at all costs to try to get your perceived right answer across the finish line. Like it says down here, it occurs from a failure to consider plausible explanations or desire for answers at any price. And it results from one of 2 reasons. One, like the previous one, there's sufficient evidence that doesn't exist. Or 2, the evidence can be explained more simply and sensibly by another idea or hypothesis. So if those of you who've taken science at Grambling, you may have studied that, hypothesis is an educated guess, and that's kind of true, but the way that you then prove that hypothesis or theory is that you run an experiment, and the data, the empirical evidence from that experiment is what the result should be, whether or not your hypothesis is correct. What happens though in a forced hypothesis is that people will fudge the data, if you will, or skew the data to make it look as though their perceived answer before they began was the right one. Here are a couple of sort of easy ideas to understand this. Professor Johnson or X, whoever, whatever professors, students received either A's or B's last semester, ... Therefore, he must be an excellent teacher. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? That is to say, he could be an excellent teacher. That's one answer. But they received A's or B's because, it's sort of a crapshoot, so to speak, of which students are in which classes or sections, so there could have been just the luck of the draw that all of these students were really bright and diligent, hardworking students, and therefore rightly earn A's or B's. Or he could be a lenient professor and just kind of give out A's and B's like candy. There are other possible explanations then. He must be an excellent teacher, which is why I kind of find a bit humorous when students glom on to things like ratemyprofessors.com or Twitter's, do take or don't take. That doesn't translate to teaching excellence. If you really want, excellent teachers, I would encourage you not to, if you want the path of least resistance, then perhaps do that. But everyone clapped at Sophia's recital, so she must be a wonderful pianist. Not necessarily, right? I mean, people often perform social politeness behavior, so maybe you clapped when in fact it was a cringeworthy recital. Okay, so letter D, non sequitur. So that's how you pronounce that, non sequitur. The root of the word, right, from Latin means to follow, and words like sequel, sequence, and segue, that's how you pronounce that word, segue, like, segue from one part of a play, act 1 to act 2, or in a joke, from one joke to another, you segue. But because it has the word non in front of it, remember this is Latin, if you guys remember from that, what is Rhetoric PowerPoint, we still, in the academy in general, in the undergraduate and graduate and professional worlds of medicine and law, we still use a lot of Latin words because we grew out of the monasteries in Europe that were originally all monks writing and speaking Latin. So with the non in front of it means it does not follow. It should follow, but it doesn't. Think of that linear point A to point B argument structure. So it occurs for a couple of different reasons, because either one, whatever the connection the arguer sees is not made clear to the audience. And this is often true in undergraduate writing. That is to say, you in your head already sort of know, like, oh, let's say I'm going to write, I'm going to switch gears slightly here. And this is essay 1, the guide or essay 1 that's due this coming September 27th. And I tell you to follow this outline, right? And you can choose any one of these topics on the second page here. But let's say you choose, like, yes, police department should be defunded, right? But then I followed up with this question, if so, how would that actually work? Because simply saying, yes, they should be defunded for these 3 reasons, this reason, that reason, and the third reason, which you then flesh out in your main body paragraphs, That's not enough. You need to actually explain to us why and how it would work, right? So why is it necessary, and how would we, where would the money go? What would it go to? And be specific about that. So that's what I meant right here, that sometimes the connection is not made clear by the arguer, you, the arguer, the writer, to the audience, to your reader, or two, the evidence of reasons offered it are irrelevant. So here are a couple of examples of that. And this, by the way, this first one was and still in some ways remains an argument that Trump supporters use. If Donald Trump could accomplish all that as a private citizen, just imagine what he could do if elected president. That is, supposedly he was a successful businessman, but it doesn't follow that because someone might be a successful CEO or business person, that they're going to be a successful elected official, because those are two different realms. One is in the private sector and the other is in the federal government, which is beholden to us, the people, right? And there are different rules of engagement. You can't just go out and ask, your brother-in-law to build you a road if you're living, let's say, like here, over down the road from Grambling is a place called Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier City, which is next to Shreveport. And let's say that the commander of the base needs or wants to build, here's the airstrip, wants to build a road back here for easy emergency exit or something. He can't just go to his brother-in-law or buddy here in Shreveport and say, hey, I know you have a road building construction company. Why don't you come over and build me a road? Because this is a federal, part of the Department of Defense, United States Air Force Base. He has to put out a bid, and then people around the nation have to bid on that and say, all right, I will do this job for this amount of money in this amount of time. And we, the government, are supposed to elect the lowest bidder to save money. Doesn't always happen, but that's the way it's supposed to work. So it doesn't follow that simply because he was a private citizen, he would do great as a president. I think we all saw how that played out pretty disastrously. Likewise, Valencia will surely get a good grade in physics because she loved her biology class well. That doesn't follow, non sequitur, because the only commonality between the two is that physics and biology are in the realm of science, right? They have very different kinds of labs, and those of you who've taken physics know that there are a lot more, there's a lot more mathematics involved in biology for sure. So moving on to letter E, slippery slope. This is perhaps one of the more common, like stereotyping above, but it's also one of the more commonly misnamed or misapplied, that someone may be making or writing or speaking a logical fallacy, and someone said, you need to stop using your slippery slopes, right? Like, but it's not a slippery slope. It may be a red herring or a false analogy or some other kind of error of reason. So I want you guys to understand this, because on the one hand, you need to avoid it in your speech and writing. And two, you need to be able to detect it in others' speech and writing, so that you as an educated person are not duped or tricked into believing other people's ideas. So what I've done here is I've included this image to kind of visualize what's happening in this so-called argument. Notice that the arrow points downward, and it says here at the top that it's a quote unquote argument that asserts that we should not proceed with step A, because if we do, the terrible consequences of X, Y, and Z will occur. And we get this type of argument, or the name really, from the Greek world, and the character is Sisyphus, who cheated death, and therefore Zeus forced him to, instead of having achieved immortality, forced him to a life of pushing a boulder up the side of a hill or mountain. But every time he would get close to the summit or the top, the boulder would slip, or he would slip, and it would roll back down, so he'd have to start again. And so it was this never-ending, lifelong process of torture, basically, right? So that's why we call it a slippery slope, because once you start down this path or road, there's no way to get back. And the reason why is because it is typically, not always, but typically signaled by the word will, which is, again, unless you're God, you cannot predict things in the future, right? It says there, it's typically signaled by words such as will. So unless you're God, you cannot logically predict the future. Here are a couple of examples of this. If we allow the government to register handguns, right? So that's the conditional statement, if this thing occurs. There's no or then in front of next, but that's what it means, right? If we allow the government to register handguns, then next it will register hunting rifles. So notice that the word will is right there. It doesn't say, like it should logically, it may or it might or it could, which are all qualifying words restricting it. It continues with this emphatic, yes, it will. And then it will prohibit all citizen ownership of guns, thereby creating a police state or a world in which only outlaws have guns, which of course is this horrible, terrible consequence down here of Z. No one wants to live in a place where only outlaws have guns. So we should therefore, according to this argument, avoid registering handguns. But really, we already register cars. We register, you have to have a license, if you will, to go hunting and fishing. So why not a lethal weapon? So another argument you may have heard, a similar kind of argument, is this. It's called the gateway drug argument. If we allow, so that's the condition starting with A, if we allow the government to legalize marijuana, it will, not it may or could, it will next legalize cocaine and heroin. Before long, our kids will be addicted to hard drugs. Not true. You could back up a little bit, even talk about, change it from, say, marijuana. You could say, if you allow kids to smoke cigarettes as kids or teenagers, then they will become potheads. No, not will. You could say may or could. It is true that if some people smoke cigarettes, they may find it easier or likely to go on to try marijuana, and some may try it and some may hate marijuana, and others may try it and they may like it, right? So it's not an automatic given that it will happen. So avoid this slippery slope and be able to detect it in other people's speech. Okay, so false dilemma. False dilemma, first of all, we should point out that a dilemma, based on the very, prefix of di here, di, like dichotomy, diurnal, it means two. And so when you're presented with a dilemma, it's usually, the kind of classic adage, between a rock and a hard place, or a fork in the road, left or right. You're presented with two possible outcomes. And this fallacy is also known as the either or fallacy, because often, though not always, often, like right here in this example, there's either or in the actual construction of the statement. So look out for that kind of wording when you take the quiz. In the What is Rhetoric PowerPoint, I mentioned that one of the tools, if you will, of learning argumentation is that we need to learn to look at multiple sides of an issue. That is to say, like a multifaceted die or a diamond, if you will, that there are many different angles or sides to one particular issue. There's rarely ever, so that's me qualifying, there's rarely ever a yes or no, black or white, so to speak, answer to a given situation. There's typically a third or fourth or more possible ways out of it. So in this image here, I've constructed this kind of dichotomy of, it's either this way or that way, or you may have heard people say it's either my way or the highway. Something is black or white. But these are, false constructs, right? And that's why it's a false dilemma, that it's people are construing it as though there are only two possible outcomes, typically neither of which are good, but there's often, like I said, a third or more. So it's not true that there's only black and white. I mean, there are in fact biracial people, mixed race people, if you will. The same is true as we're learning, more about the LGBTQI community. It's more complicated than male, female, especially if you go look up the word intersex, one word, INTERSEX, which is a real genetic phenomenon. Life is much more complicated than we're presented as young people, or that, you are either a Christian or you're an infidel. It's what Christians might call, say, Muslims or non-believers, or vice versa, what, Muslims might call Christians, that they're infidels because they don't believe in Allah, which, by the way, it's the same exact God for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, same exact God. So here are some examples. Students must either be good students or good athletes. Well, clearly false. They could be good students and they could be bad athletes. Or they could be good students and good athletes. Or they could be bad students and good athletes. Or finally, they could be bad students and bad athletes. So clearly, there's not simply a yes or no answer to that. There are multiple outcomes. May have heard something like this: I thought you were a good person, but you were not at church today, as though going to church somehow makes you a good person. I think with all the church scandals recently, you guys may be aware that simply, the formality of going to church doesn't make you a good person, right? I think it's more in acts than deeds than it is in, appearance. You will have to quit that high pressure job or you will get an ulcer. Well, no, you could take a vacation, you could work from home, you could, compromise your hours or, do something else. We don't necessarily have to quit. And this is a pretty common one. If you really loved me, you would do this X, Y, or Z for me, right? Let you fill in the blank. It's a kind of built-in either or. Either you love me or you don't love me. Not necessarily true. Okay, moving on, false analogy. A false analogy is trying to be an analogy, but like the false dilemma, it is false. So like here, it says an analogy draws a comparison between two dissimilar things by highlighting any similarities. So let me give you an example. Some years ago, before I came to Grambling, I used to teach at the University of Colorado at Boulder, which they call CU Boulder there. And it's in a lovely kind of mountainside setting. It's just a little northeast or northwest of Denver. So this is the campus. And just there in the background are the foothills, if you will, because there are much, much bigger mountains behind this. These are the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And so you can see how they're kind of rugged and jagged, right? So if you said not using like or as, because that would be a simile, but you used a metaphor saying something is something. If I said the Rocky Mountain is a dinosaur's back, or vice versa, what you're doing then is you're taking two dissimilar things, mountains and a dinosaur's back, and you're drawing a similarity. In that case, we're talking about the jaggedness, if you will, of the mountains. So the problem with a false analogy is that it tries to, again, take two different things and jam them together, but it doesn't quite work because the similarity isn't correct. So here's an example. This must be a great car, for like the finest watches in the world is made in Switzerland. Well, that doesn't quite work because it is true that Switzerland is known for its fine watches, or what we call chronometers. Many of you might know, or even some of you might own, an authentic Rolex, which, as you can see, is made in Switzerland. The Swiss are quite well known for centuries now, really, for making really fine watches. So if you look at what's called the bezel, the face of a watch, you'll see down here, Swiss made, right? So, you know, yes, they make great watches in Switzerland, but do they also make great cars in Switzerland? Like what great cars do you know of that are great selling or fast or whatever, right? It's really not an accurate comparison. However, if you wanted to keep the car, say this must be a great car for like the finest blank in the world, it was made in blank, you would need to retool this statement to say, okay, well, where are some of the finest cars made? You know, you could say Germany, right? But what if I said, well, you know, where's this car? Where's the Ferrari made? Or where's the Lamborghini made? Or where's the Maserati made, right? Or the Ducati and so on. They're all made in Italy. So if you just rejiggered or retooled this sentence and you said, this must be a great car for like the finest, what, wine? Because Italy has great wine, or the finest art, you know, think of Florence, you know, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and so on. It was made in Italy. So that analogy would make sense if you retooled that. Likewise, if someone says making people register their own, making people register their own guns is like the Nazis making the Jews register with their government. The policy is crazy. So what this is doing is taking two different things, registering handguns, which many people who belong to the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and tout the Second Amendment, they don't want to register their handguns. They just say, you know, I can own a gun and I shouldn't have to register it. They're saying it's a kind of fascist or Nazi way of forcing people to do something. But that's on the one hand. So registering handguns is on the one hand. They're saying, though, here that it's like making Jews register for their government, which, if you recall World War II, of course, the Nazis required Jews, people of color, homosexuals to register with the government. So they knew where they were the entire time and could track them down and kill them. That is not the same kind of analogy, because on the one hand, you don't have to own a gun. I mean, it is your right to, but you're not forced to own a gun. But if you're a Jew or person of color or gay, especially, genetically, it's not like, you're born that way. Many people can, of course, convert to Judaism, but many, and most, in fact, are born into the ethnicity, the religion, the culture, right? So it's just who they are. So it's really, kind of false to say that those things are equivalent. It's also kind of an absurd statement. All right, let's go ahead and move on. PostTalk. PostTalk is a shortened version for the longer Latin term. So again, Latin of post hoc ergo propter hoc, meaning after this, therefore because of it. So what this is an argument with a cause and effect problem. So again, argument must be linear, go from point A to point B, but this often shifts the cause and effect, right? That it's the time sequence of cause and effect is reversed. I have this little image here of a voodoo doll because in many ways, superstitions are a kind of post hoc fallacy. That is to say, so-and-so, let's say, I don't know, you could say Haiti, or you could go back to West Africa or New Orleans, where someone practices voodoo, and you could say, someone created a voodoo doll of someone else. And the person who created the voodoo doll stuck pins in it, and the person who is supposed to represent actually like contracted a tumor or cancer. And we would say, oh, that's because the person who constructed the voodoo doll was practicing black magic that affected that person. So it avoids any kind of scientific evidence or data that maybe this person has genetic predisposition to tumors or cancers, or lived in an area where the water and pollution was terrible and contracted cancer, or had an unhealthy diet, or alcoholism, or a number of other possible answers, and attributes it to something that occurred before the cancer was detected. We're about to have next month, in fact, Halloween, when a bunch of superstitions are supposed to come alive, the black cat crossing your path, or you probably are familiar with others like don't split the pole, don't step on the crack, break your mother's back, or don't let your feet be swept by a broom. If you do, then you have to spit on it to neutralize the curse, if you will. So there are a bunch of superstitions, and one of which is similar to this is praying to statues, if you will, or using inanimate objects as religious icons and devices. So this is a criticism by Protestants. So Protestants are Christians, but they're not Catholic, meaning they would be, for example, Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Mormon, Seventh-day Adventist, Pentecostal, and so on, all Christian but not Catholic. But in the Catholic Church, which technically was the original Christian religion before it broke off in 1517 under Luther, 1519, excuse me, in the Protestant Reformation. Many people will go to a Catholic church who are devout Catholics, and they will kneel in front of a statue and pray to the statue, whether it's the Virgin Mary or and they may even light a candle, right? These are all statues of kneeling. I try to use Google Images just for quick, showing you what I'm talking about. Because I know some of you may not have ever been inside a Catholic church. So here, and I'm not dissing this woman and her faith. What I'm pointing out though is that, let's say, she's devoutly praying to hear, the statue of the Virgin Mary, and she wants something fixed in her life, or family member to get better, or success, or whatever. And let's say that comes true, that a week or two later, her husband or son or whoever gets better, and she will say it's because her prayer was answered because she prayed to the statue of the Virgin Mary. You may also know that Catholics use prayer beads, which are called a rosary, and rosaries are not, if you've ever seen people wearing around their neck, they're not supposed to be worn around their neck like this. It's supposed to simply be brought out when you're going to pray. And, it's a signal, an outward signal of devotion, of piety, that you're quite deliberately, asking for whatever. And some people will say or Catholics would say, and I know this because I went to Catholic school for 9 years, kinder through 8th grade, that your prayer is more favorable when God or Mary or whoever hears it if you pray with a rosary, right? Because it shows your devoutness. And these prayer beads, by the way, are blessed by the priest. Just as when you walk into a Catholic church, there's a little fount or little kind of container, if you will, of water, and you're supposed to dip your finger in it and do the sign of the cross to ward off evil spirits, if you will, right? So it's holy because the priest has blessed it, right? And many people would say, well, no, that's just hogwash. I don't believe it, right? Anyway, so post hoc, try to avoid those fallacies. They can trip us up sometimes. Let's move on to the second portion of the logical fallacies. And these are, again, a little more pernicious. Pernicious is a fancy word for evil or malicious. And it's because, right, injurious, hurtful, wicked, or evil. So it is because people often deliberately know that they are not either answering the question or kind of creating a diversionary tactic. Unlike the previous ones that, they sort of attempt to answer the question, but they're oversimplifying the issue. So the first one is begging the question. And the question here, as it says below, is not an actual like question with question mark, but it's whatever topic or issue is under discussion. Okay, something that needs to be decided, and therefore it's under question. And to beg something in this context means to draw or elicit an answer before it's ever actually answered, to sort of prove that it is without proving it. And it's triggered by phrases like the fact is, as we can see, obviously and clearly. So keep that in mind when answering the logical fallacy quiz. If you see phrases like that, you go, wait a minute, is this begging the question? So here's an example. Prosecutor to defendant. Remember, defendant is the one on trial. So how did you feel when you killed your wife? And so what the prosecutor is trying to do is make it a foregone conclusion that the defendant in fact killed his or her wife, when in fact it hasn't been proven yet, right? And so if you have a good attorney, he or she to that question will say objection, leading the witness, right? That this question is leading the witness to a conclusion that hasn't been proven. So it's begging the question of whether or not the murder has actually happened, much less this person did it. Or this whole abortion debate about human life begins is ridiculous. We should be thinking about the rights of the baby. Unless you live in Texas, then it's not ridiculous. It's a serious kind of issue now. So this is begging the question because of a couple of reasons. One, it says here about the rights of the baby, right? So a couple of things. One, you're assuming that, and no determination of time here, whether it's, as Texas has said, it's 6 weeks or it's 2 days or 6 months. No time demarcation is included in this statement. So is it a baby? On the one hand, right? Some will say yes, it's the moment of conception. And some will say no, like, you can't say a mass of cells as a zygote is even viable. It doesn't even have a heartbeat yet. And then even if it is a baby, does a creature, so to speak, fetus is, something that is unviable if you took it out before, the second trimester, would it be able to have rights if it cannot live on its own, right? So that's a kind of tricky way to construe the argument that, yes, it's automatically true. We shouldn't even be talking about it. But you haven't proven that those points are true. And likewise, we can't ignore the opinions of the best movie critics. Clearly, the movie is not worth seeing. A lot of people are swayed by reviews, shall we say, right? And reviews aren't necessarily a bad thing. You just have to take them with a grain of salt, if you will. So, for example, let me take a movie that I like. If you guys haven't seen it, check it out. It's a Spike Lee film called Chirac, and it's kind of a riff off of Aristophanes' comedy called Lysistrata. And it's set in Chicago, but kind of post, Iraq war, and there's a lot of gang violence included. But anyway, so if you go down to like, reception, if you will, like how is it received by the public, and these kind of takes or summaries, there's something about Rotten Tomatoes. The film has received 82% based on 146 reviews. Really? 146? How many millions of people are in the United States alone? 340 million people. And there's only 146 on Rotten Tomatoes. And who's doing the reviewing of Rotten Tomatoes? Anyone? Just like, again, ratemyprofessors.com, anyone can go in there and, they don't even have to be going to that university. They can write a claim about an instructor. So we got to be careful about what people say in terms of reviews. Here's an example. I mentioned this in the What is Rhetoric under the aesthetic judgment section. If you have ever seen a film or television show or, song or CD for that matter, and, you really thought it was dope and you wanted to recommend it to your friends, family, significant other, and, you told them, hey, go check out this film or song or whatever, and they came back and they're like, yeah, I'm just not feeling it, right? Like, yeah, it wasn't that great or couldn't make it through it. It's because we all have our own kind of aesthetic judgment and like or dislike certain kinds of things or critique it in different ways. So just because there may be movie critics or film critics or music critics or whatever saying that something is good doesn't necessarily mean it is a blockbuster or it's amazing. Okay, circular reasoning. This is the fancy word, as I mentioned a moment ago, called tautology in Latin. So I've represented this here with the Ouroboros or Ouroboros, this ancient symbol of the snake or dragon eating its own tail. So it's simultaneously death, but it's also life because it's eating, and in a kind of eternal circle, if you will. But I want to include that because remember, a linear argument goes from point A to point B, but this starts at point A and goes back on point A. It doesn't ever get to B, C, or D. Here's an example. Baseball is exciting because it's such a stimulating sport. If you take the word exciting and stimulating and switch them around and say baseball is stimulating because it is such an exciting sport, you're saying the exact same thing with no new information. So what you need to do to get out of this argument is right after, because kind of separates over here, a claim, it is exciting, and over here, the result. Everything after because needs to be very specific. So you need, again, like in your essays, right? I say, follow this outline. You can't just say, okay, we should defund the police, right? For this reason, that reason, the other. Well, you can't leave it there. You have to actually explain why. And so you have 3 main body paragraphs, color coded to your main ideas, where you explain in detail with, a specific example of facts, quotation of why you think it should be defunded, and therefore why your opponents in paragraph 2 are wrong. So you could say basketball is exciting because it has the fast break. You are physically closer to the court and players as opposed to, say, a football field. And back in my day, people slam dunk, they would shatter the glass, or something like that. But those are all 3 specific reasons that would make it an exciting or stimulating sport. Likewise, girls should not play on boys' teams because they are not boys. Well, the are not boys logically and semantically means girls by definition, the other category, so to speak. So now in this world of trans identity and LGBTQI plus, becomes a little trickier to categorize girls and boys, obviously, but even so, you need to give specific reasons, like the basketball example, of why they should not, be on boys' teams. And you could say, well, and I'll just give you 3, and this is, just off the top of my head and not necessarily applicable in all cases, but you could say, girls should not play on boys' teams because girls are weaker than boys, or more frail, or susceptible to injury. Having been in, former Marine, or I am a ex-Marine, there are women who are taller and beefier than I am. I'm only 5'10" or so, but there are women, as you know, look at the WNBA, who are 6'1" and taller, built, strong, have stamina, and they can put the hurt on you if they want to. So the foregone conclusion, the assumption, and really forced hypothesis, if you think about it, is that somehow girls will not be able to hang in, say, basketball or football. And that leads to a second possible reason why they shouldn't be. Not that I agree with it, but some people claim that, well, it'll create unfair play, meaning, let's say if it's a football team, the males will, not want to hurt the female, so they'll go a little bit lighter on them and not tackle them as hard, or vice versa. Because they don't want them on their team, they'll try to hurt them and really like dogpile them, or put them, take them out of the game. In either case, that's not fair treatment, right? And a third possible reason is you could say, well, it will cause sexual tension or morale problems if there are females and males on the same team, because where they're going to shower, and if there's an away game, where are they sleeping, and what if one becomes romantically involved with another team member, and so on, right? But you can say the same thing of a male team and a female team, right? So it's a kind of illogical argument there. Anyway, so just when you look at a circular reasoning argument, make sure that there are specific reasons that are given for why something is such a way, and it doesn't just turn back in on itself. Red herring. So red herring, or herring itself, I should show you, is an actual fish, and happens to have a kind of pretty strong fishy foul odor, right? So imagine this scenario. We're having, like in an actual classroom, we're having a discussion about something, and someone comes to the door and is holding one of these herrings, foul smelling fish, right? So whatever we were just talking about, whether it's the economy or, should Grambling actually build an auditorium, or when is the digital commons going to be finished, or whatever the topic is we're discussing, we're no longer talking about it, and our attention has been diverted to this foul smelling fish. So this is in fact a diversionary tactic, right? It is a very common rhetorical strategy used a lot, not always, by politicians. That is, they're asked a specific question and they pivot, if you will, to an entirely different issue on the table. So what we need to do, right, as readers or listeners of a red herring fallacy, is we need to discredit that by calling out, like, saying, wait a minute, that's not what we're talking about. That's has nothing to do, that fish has nothing to do with the natatorium or whatever issue, and we need to redirect back to what we're discussing. So here's an example. Before we decide to hire a lawyer, we should remember that many lawyers have been recently found guilty of corruption. Okay, well, the issue is hiring a lawyer. It should go without saying that you want to hire an attorney who is, of course, not guilty of corruption. So why even bring that up? It's sort of has no place. It's irrelevant in the discussion. Likewise, this is a common one you hear among politicians. The senator is an honest man. He loves sports and plays with his children on the weekends. So, I mean, he's a family man and he likes sports. That doesn't translate to honesty. So what a lot of people want you to believe is that, and this is kind of the pathos-driven argument, tugging on your emotions, is that somehow a married man, a family man, and liking sports, whether it's football or basketball, signals that he's a hunky-dory, wholesome person, right? But that has nothing to do with honesty. Honesty is, for example, like if there was a staff member of his who was found guilty of embezzling money, that he not only called it out, but he fired that person, right? That he didn't sweep it under the rug, which would be dishonest. So honesty, like previous, acts and deeds of Christianity, has to do with, not simply the appearance of things, but like how you actually behave. In an actual exchange with former President Reagan, before most of your times, he was ailing, as he was, he served 8 years, 2 terms. And what we know now after he died is that in his later years, he had what we would call onset dementia and, early stages of Alzheimer's. And at times during press conferences, he would actually say things like, well, I don't recall, genuinely, right? And so we didn't know at the time, but we know now, like, oh, he like really didn't remember. But because of his age, he was asked a question by a reporter here, Mr. President, your opponent, Walter Mondale, is considerably younger than you. Do you think that the threat of nuclear war, age should, or with the threat of nuclear war, age should be an issue in this campaign? So the report is bringing up a pretty serious issue about, you're going to have your finger on the button and have the nuclear football, age, is kind of important. We want to make sure you're mentally there. And rather than addressing it in a serious way, he made a joke about it, right? Kind of diverted and said, not at all. I'm not going to exploit my opponent's youth and inexperience. And everyone, of course, chuckled, but it left the question unanswered, right? Like, what about your age, So we saw how that played out. Straw man. Straw man, here represented with the scarecrow, is a kind of, deliberate, again, pernicious tactic, and it creates a false representation or image of your opponent and then attacks that false representation. So one of the common methods is to burn someone in effigy. So an effigy is like a dummy or a false representation of someone or something. I don't know if I have any images here, but so let's see. This happens to many heads of state or politicians. So when Obama was in office, people both in the United States and around the globe would create these false representations of him and then, burn him and the flag as if to represent, this is what we hate about American policy. Yeah, there's pretty terrible images here. But, you could say the same thing of Trump too, that people would create effigies. So obviously, this is not an actual Donald Trump. It's a representation of the former president in quotes. And then that person is attacked with the representation or through the representation. So it's a kind of diversionary tactic by not addressing the person or the person's argument in front of you, but turning off to the side and saying, okay, I'm going to create this false narrative, if you will, of this person or their argument, and then attack that. Here are a couple of examples. Proponents of sex education want to give kids license to have sex without consequences. Well, honestly, it's just the opposite of that. But people who are trying to distort the facts want you to believe otherwise. So people who, want to give kids sex education, proponents, advocates of sex education, actually want younger people to be informed about sexual activity and its consequences. So whether they talk about contraception or other, methods, or even consent and pleasure for that matter, that doesn't mean that they are advocating that, oh, therefore you should go out and now do it or try it. They're saying that if this is going to happen in your life, this is what you need to know. But the fact that people even talk to minors high school, junior high kids about sexual education or activity seems to lead conservative people who are all about, abstinence until you're married, to this notion that, well, you want them to, just have a free-for-all without consequences. And that's totally kind of just the opposite of what they're driving at. Or this one, those who oppose a tax cut just want the poor to get less government assistance. So let's think about this for a second. Generally speaking, I'll put the Senate back up here, and notice as I'm saying this, I'm qualifying my argument by saying, generally, not all. So represented here in blue are liberals or Democrats. Think of Obama and Biden. And then represented in red are Republicans or conservatives. So right now in the House, it's pretty much down the middle, 50-50, with Kamala Harris, right, being the vice president with the swing vote. So generally speaking, it is liberals or Democrats, the blue here, that support either the status quo or remaining the same in terms of tax and tax programs, whether it's SNAP or women, infants, children, Head Start, and student federal financial aid for that matter. That's all from tax money. They generally support that and usually support increasing it because of inflation. It is over here in the Republican conservative side, and I'm generalizing, but it's generally the case, that they want lower or fewer taxes, or they want what's called a tax cut, a cut on taxes. So right here, those who oppose a tax cut, well, that would generally be liberals or Democrats. Those who oppose the tax cut just want the poor to get less government assistance? No, that's not, that is just the opposite, right? But in a kind of distorted, twisted way, again, the straw man is not a real creature. It's a semblance of a real creature. What they're saying in this distorted argument is that, oh, well, if you increase taxes, then the poor are going to get less because it's going to go to other programs like Department of Defense or education or other programs, and not directly to the poor, like Medicaid or Medicare, perhaps. So it's really a kind of, again, distorted argument. We need to detect it, ferret it out, and not accept it. So here's only a couple of more left, but here's the ad hominem attack, which is a very common one, like the stereotype and slippery slope. And it means to the man, Latin. But one of the most common forms is name calling and bullying, right? So when people are standing outside at 3 o'clock in the morning in the front yard, yelling at each other, quite literally yelling at each other, they're no longer having an argument in the proper sense of the word. They're having what is called an altercation, right? So that's a heated or angry dispute. In a proper argument, right, you keep a level head and you're calm, cool, collected, and you don't call a person names, right? And you immediately lose your audience. You alienate your audience when you begin name calling them. So, in the outline again that you're supposed to follow for all of these essays, in paragraph 2, so paragraph 1 is your introduction and thesis. In paragraph 2, you're supposed to directly acknowledge what your opponents think about your topic. So, if it's defund the police, then you want to defund the police, then who would be your opponents? Well, those who want to keep funding as it is for police or even increase it, right? That is probably those who don't support the Black Lives Matter movement or racial equality in general. So you would need to define and clearly explain one or two issues here of your opponents, right? Your opposition. And refutation is a fancy argumentative persuasive term for rejecting, the rejection of your opponents. So here's a couple of examples of ad hominem. Hey, Professor Smith, we shouldn't have to read this book by Sigmund Freud. Everybody knows he used cocaine. Okay, yes, it's true. He used cocaine, but in the late 1880s and the late 1800s, as well as the early 19th century, many people used cocaine because it was not only fairly easy to get, but we didn't at the time understand just how addictive it was. And so many people used cocaine. In fact, as you may know, that's where we get the name Coca-Cola. It had traces of actual cocaine in it until they substituted cocaine with caffeine and sugar. But Freud himself, you may recall, this is, like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, meaning the baby's the good thing and the bathwater is now the dirty thing, but don't throw it all away. So Sigmund Freud actually in psychology, psychotherapy brought us some important key terms and ideas like the unconscious, the conscious, the id, the superego, the ego, which we still use today, So here's another example. Why should we honor Susan B. Anthony with a commemorative coin? She was just another puritanical do-gooder. So it's attacking the person, in this case, Susan B. Anthony, the women's suffragist leader. And ladies, you can, thank women like her and others for, getting out there and marching and getting you the right to vote eventually in 1920. But so, yes, she was, as it says here, she was a Quaker. This is very kind of, religious, formal, back then, especially religion. But just because she was helping others out doesn't mean we should not honor her with a commemorative coin, which we in fact did. There's something called the Susan B. Anthony silver dollar, right? But, we have other kinds of commemorative coins and stamps. I mean, I think there's a Marilyn Monroe stamp. There's an Elvis stamp, like, do really we'll have this stamp and not Susan B. Anthony, someone who really helped women out. So don't attack the person, right? Attack what they stand for or what their argument really is, what the issue is. Appeal to authority. So the appeal to authority is the misuse or misapplication of someone's name, identity, or brand outside their expertise. So I have this image here of the former quote unquote president as a way to remind you that his supporters, even then and now, thought that he was such a great businessman. But if you look at the facts, he had a number of failed ventures and many bankruptcies and still owes, as far as we know, over $400 million to perhaps foreign interests. So what makes him such a good president, right? In other words, being a failed businessman does not make him automatically a good public servant or president. Likewise, you want someone's expertise in that field, right? So Kanye, he made drop some great songs and tracks, but he's not an athlete. If you wanted to retool this sentence to make it make sense, you could say, not Gary Yeezy are dope kicks because Michael Jordan knows his way around the court, right? And has spent thousands of hours on the basketball court, then yeah, that would make sense because they're basketball shoes. Unless, you're only buying them for the style and not the athleticism of them. Or Wheaties must be a healthy cereal because so many successful athletes recommend it. Well, not necessarily, meaning some of you may be athletes, and I'm pretty sure you probably eat more than just Wheaties, right? Part of the supposed, what do you call it? Here's Serena Williams. Bargain or endorsement of Wheaties is that the athlete is supposed to eat it every morning. Okay, well, I don't know if they do, but many people have, endorsed Wheaties, and just because they do doesn't automatically make it a great cereal, right? So we might need to say something else is a healthy breakfast food because so many athletes recommend it. They're recommending it, of course, because they're getting money to recommend it. It's called an endorsement. All right, common practice and bandwagon. This is familiar to many of you because it's the basic notion that, hey, everyone's doing it, it's okay argument. But the majority is not always right, as your parents or whomever may have told you, if Joey jumps off a cliff, are you going to jump off a cliff too, right? So what we need to do is reject the common practice and say, just because other people are doing it doesn't mean it's right or good. So using hidden notes during a test isn't as bad as copying from another student's paper. Besides, everybody cheats in school. So first of all, this is an overstatement because it says everybody cheats. But even if it would say most people or virtually all people cheat in school, one, that's hard to quantify. How do you really know that? And two, that doesn't make it right. To give the biblical notion of, two wrongs don't make a right. It's not algebra. Or my mother is on my back about not going to church because she is embarrassed that church people are asking about me. So she's getting pressure from congregation members that her child isn't going to church, therefore she's pressuring the child. That's often how society works, is through social pressure, peer pressure, right? But it doesn't mean it's necessarily right for that child to go, because at a certain age, 18, I believe, you become your own person, an adult, and you can go or not go. Or here, try this Tide Pod. All the kids are rising to the challenge. Yeah, that should speak for itself. Pretty insane. Hope you never did it or encourage people to do it. Or the, I don't know, habanero challenge or cinnamon challenge or whatever new challenge there is. Doesn't make it okay. So ad populum is to the people. This is a pretty slick fallacy because what it tries to do is appeal to your emotion, that kind of pathos-driven argument, and different kinds of emotion. It can be based on beliefs of Christianity or religion, or some group that you belong to, like, you should do this because you belong to an HBCU, or you should do this because you're a Christian, or you should do this because you're an American, whatever the heck that means, right? So here's a couple examples. This is a quote from the former president. So he brought this young white kid, Preston, to the White House and kind of paraded him around. And he said, "Young patriots like Preston teach all of us about our civic duty as Americans. president's reverence for those who have served our nation reminds us when we salute our flag, when we put our hand on our hearts for the Pledge of Allegiance, and why we proudly stand for the national anthem, which is a direct kind of jibe at professional athletes who chose to sit or kneel during the national anthem, right? You know, the entire social justice issue being erased in the argument. So it's kind of forcing you to say, well, you know, if you're you're a real American, you'll do it, right? Otherwise, you're not a real American. Or God must exist because every culture has some sort of belief in a higher being and billions of people cannot be wrong. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that God exists if billions of people are believing in it. It's just what some people are being taught and they reteach it to their kids. So you get to decide for yourself. So this is sort of, you know, again, that tugging on your emotion of wanting to belong to a group, perhaps a religious group in this context, right? Okay, that is the end of the basic logic and logical fallacies handout. And this last 2 pages, as I mentioned, are the quiz itself. So I would, you know, you can, of course, take the quiz multiple times before this coming Monday, but, you know, you might want to just try to work them out here on this page 10 before you actually, what do you call it, take the quiz. So that's it for now. Again, that was over module 2, the basic logical fallacies file, and I'll link to this video lecture. All right, folks, if you have questions, please feel free to inbox me in Canvas. Hope you guys are doing well and take care. Bye-bye.